This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. I've been pretty high on the Browns offseason so far, but let's see what others have. Pro Football Focus is doing their offseason grades, and they're talking about the Cleveland Browns now. Let's see where I agree with Pro Football Focus and where I disagree.
Yeah, I think they had a great offseason as well. Obviously capped off with a recent move with the trade for Zadarius Smith. Smith had more pressures than every edge rusher not named Myles Garrett combined on the Cleveland Browns last year. You also bring in Ogbo Okoronkwo from Houston, which I love now because, you know, on passing downs, on third downs, you probably kick Smith inside and have Okoronkwo, Garrett on the edge, and then Smith and Dalvin Tomlinson on the interior. I mean, that is a gigantic upgrade from what they had last year. And Jim Schwartz is now calling the shots on defense, which I think is going underrated. You know, everyone should be kind of, lauding Miami for getting Vic Fangio. Schwartz is a really, really good defensive play caller as well. We saw Tennessee, they rotated.
See, this is where I'm talking about when I said in the video yesterday, anything can be reality because there's so many different pockets going on. Jim Schwartz being here has not been understated. Right. It's been one of the things that I've been worried about getting overrated because we're talking about Jim Schwartz fixing things overnight that could still be a problem. And I'm kind of worried that we're going to blame him for not being like the ultimate fixer in a way that's kind of unrealistic. But then you flip over to a more national look of it, and they feel like the whole Jim Schwartz element has been underrated because they're not in this market, obviously, hearing how we talk about it. But again, it depends on where you're at. If you're national, you might not even know that Jim Schwartz is the defensive coordinator for the Cleveland Browns, or the Browns really changed out anything. Because how many teams do we keep up with their coordinator changes when they don't have coaching changes that aren't like top 3 contenders in the NFL? You know, we don't usually keep up with that kind of thing. But in Cleveland, we do. Right. So it's one of those things where, again, we're putting a lot of hype on something, or it might seem like there's a lot of hype on something, but you have to remember hype is relative to where you're at. Right. It's the ultimate saying, right? If a tree falls down in the woods, nobody's around to hear it. Did it really fall down? Right. If hype happens and nobody outside the bubble hears it, was it really hype? You know? It's an interesting question to ask, but I think that's interesting that they thought that about Jim Schwartz.
Is the trade for Elijah Moore. So for a couple of reasons. A, I think you needed more weapons besides Amari Cooper. I think Moore is such a different skill set. He is a quick separator. You're going to put him in the slot. He can win down the field. He has speed, but I think just gives you kind of a different skill set. And then, of course, Donovan Peoples-Jones will kind of be the big body, go up and get a guy on the outside. But also in that.
This is something that also, I think there's a difference, a bit of a gap between what people outside and what people inside think. And sometimes we can be so close to it that we can't see what's obvious. And sometimes we can be close enough to it to where we can see what would seem obvious is not. And Donovan Peoples-Jones is a perfect example of that. I like him, but you look at Donovan Peoples-Jones and you see some of his highlights and you think he's a go up and get it guy. And I think we have a similar relationship to Donovan Peoples-Jones that Pittsburgh Steelers fans had with Chase Claypool, to where if you're not in Pittsburgh, you don't really understand why Steelers fans are so done with Chase Claypool. But then you talk to Steelers fans who are done with Chase Claypool and it starts to make sense. And not saying that Donovan Peoples-Jones, like we're done with DPJ in that way, but he does do the similar frustrating stuff to where he's a big body. You would expect him to go up and get it, but he doesn't really play that way. Yes, he makes a lot of diving catches, but those aren't, I'm going to go up on a 50-50 ball and muscle somebody diving catch kind of catches. Those are, I keep my feet in bounds because I overran a route, or I came out of break late, so I got to dive. Or, he's really good at the leaning kind of catch, right? Like that kind of acrobatic catch. But when you're talking about a player you need in the red zone to just consistently get you a 50-50 ball, that's a different skill set than what DPJ has. And I think people look at him, see the numbers and go, oh yeah, he should be that guy, but he's not. And I think that's one of the bigger disconnects that we have from local to national On him.
trade, instead of just giving a pick to go get Elijah Moore, they do a pick swap and they actually use that third round pick on Cedric Tillman. So you added 2 wide receivers for moving down around in the draft. And I think that was just a smart way to really overhaul your receiving core. Look, it's a tough division, like I said, but this roster on paper is pretty loaded. If, of course, big if, Deshaun Watson can get back to a former version that we did not see last year.
So there were a lot of people in the chat and the replies previously when we talked about it complaining about my characterization of how the trade for Zadarius Smith actually ends up netting out. So you, as somebody who's done this, who's done work on not improving the Jimmy Johnson trade chart, but having a better trade chart, a better, more accurate, more modern day interpretation, how would you sum up the algebra of when you start canceling out all those picks? What is the net of what Cleveland gave up for that contract?
Yeah, so it's again, I like pick swaps a lot because if you're going to move, I mean, look, 2/5 for what was like a 6th and a 7th.
Yeah.
Realistically, none of those picks could be anything. I think on our chart, it comes out to the Vikings gained an equivalent.
I have an issue with draft charts because a lot of draft charts are trying to make you feel like you want to trade or that you're trying to project that you're going to win a trade when you can't really know with draft trades, right? If you feel like you're giving up a sure thing for a bunch of draft picks, like sure, the draft chart might say that's right. Like let's say, for example, in 2014 when the Browns traded back for Justin Gilbert. They traded the 4th pick to move back to 8. And then they drafted Justin Gilbert. Now, the trade that they used to get back to 8 was a great trade according to the charts, right? And it's great value. But then you drafted Justin Gilbert and it didn't matter. See, the charts can't tell you what the value of your trade is if you are right or wrong about a player. And I think that's where following and being so strict on these charts can get people in trouble, because at the end of the day, if you really believe that a player is going to be a home run, I don't care what the chart says about the draft pick, right? And that's why I defended the Texans getting up and getting Will Anderson, because look, I'm not the biggest believer in Will Anderson, but if you believe in Will Anderson to that level to where you're willing to trade to get a Will Anderson in that draft, as well as getting CJ Stroud with your original pick, then hey, you must believe that he's going to be that level of player. And if he is that level of player, it works out. He don't even got to be Hall of Famer. He got to just be, make an all-pro team once or twice, and it works out. A lot of trade value stuff when it comes to the draft doesn't factor in if you get good players or not. And that's the most important part. Like you can win the Jimmy Johnson chart all you want or get the proper value for a trade for a player, but if the person that you get in return is good, it doesn't matter. We don't care about that stuff. So I think the charting stuff, it's a fun thing to have. It's a fun thing to add into a conversation. But sometimes we're so diehard about these draft charts that it makes me question the whole point of even doing it, because when we take it that seriously, it's so obvious what the flaws are in people who just think strictly to the chart. And sometimes that happens with Pro Football Focus, where they're so strict on the chart that they forget that this game isn't a science, it's a sport. And you can't make it a science. Like, there's just going to be some variables in there that we cannot calculate for.
Of like a mid-5th round pick. The bigger thing was they were not going to pay him, or they didn't want to pay him. He was clearly disgruntled, was owed about $12.5 million, I want to say, for this year, and about $20 million the year after that. Instead, he comes to Cleveland. The last year of the deal is chopped off, so he's in a contract year, and it sounds like they reworked the deal a little bit to give him more guarantees and a slightly lower base value. So yeah, Minnesota picks up some picks, but it's more about clearing money. They obviously go out and sign Marcus Davenport for a reason. I think it's kind of just like a win-win. Like, every party in this arrangement won.
All right, so mid-5th round pick is the net of that trade. I think I'd say it saw somewhere that it was a 7th round pick was the equivalent, but it's higher than I thought it was. There you go.
There you go.
I think the Browns offseason generally, they've had a lot of talent. They've added talent at the right areas. That defensive line was a mess last season. We talked about Zadarius Smith, Okoronkwo as well, Dalvin Tomlinson. In the draft, they hit it as well. That defensive line should be dramatically better than it was last year. And, there's not a whole lot of targeting the secondary, but you look at the secondary last year, and on paper, it should have been really good. It just wasn't, in part because the defensive line was getting gashed and they weren't able to make plays to help the secondary. So I think they're kind of banking on the idea that if all these defensive line additions, the front seven guys work out, then the guys we have on the back end should play much better than they did a year ago.
This is like you have a general practitioner and then you have a specialist, right? And this feels like that, right? If you're going to give a general diagnosis on what went wrong with the Browns defense last year in the secondary, you could say that. But the specialists that knows exactly what was going on last year could tell you, oh, brother, it was a bunch of things going on in that secondary, right? None of it was talent related. And sometimes they were so talented in that secondary that they overcame what they overcame. But the coaching upgrade, I think we in Cleveland understand how big of a deal that is because we've sat here and been the only ones complaining about the communication issues on the secondary, why these things can't get right, how many busted coverages are we going to get. So we understand the difference that defensive coordinator is going to make there just being competent, because having a competent defensive coordinator, I think, has been the difference between this defense being an embarrassment and this team defense being a good one. It's been that serious. But again, people who aren't with us every day, they don't understand that about the team. Also, I've heard this, right? Oh, well, the Browns secondary got cooked last year. I don't know why people are acting as if this is a good secondary. Fair enough, right? The Browns secondary was bad last year at times. But again, it's a whole different world when you understand what the problems were, right? You can't sit here and tell me that the Browns secondary is bad because they're not good players in there, because I've seen all of these players play well. I've seen Greg Newsome play well in the NFL. I've seen Denzel Ward play well in the NFL. I've seen Martin Emerson play well in the NFL. And at times the secondary was able to do what they needed to do, right? As much as they did get cooked last year. So like against the Bengals in Monday Night Football, they were able to do what they needed to do, right? So much is going to get talked about and so much is misunderstood about why that defense stunk last year. And I think a lot of people naturally focused on the defensive line. And look, that was a part of it. But I think the defensive line was a symptom of what the real problem was, which was Joe Woods, right? And I'm not one to unilaterally blame somebody, but like how obvious was it during the year that those issues existed because nobody trusted what they were supposed to do on defense. And it was just one of the more obvious things, if you had been watching this team for a while closely, that was wrong with this team.
I think it's a huge piece of it. And a very underrated small move they made was bringing in Rodney McLeod, who was with Indianapolis last year, was obviously with Philly for, 6-7 years. I think all of those with Jim Schwartz. So not only the defensive line, which is a huge, huge part of it, but I also think the talent is obvious in this back seven in the secondary, but every guy was like 25 years old or younger. And now I think you have, kind of that cagey veteran to help, a Greg Newsome, help a Denzel Ward, help a Grant Delpit. Yeah, like I said, on paper, I'm in love with this team. They just got to show up and actually do it.
That's a fair assessment, though. That's a fair assessment. They gave the Browns an A in the offseason grade. Let me know. Do y'all agree with Pro Football Focus? Would you give them an A? I think I would give them a similar grade, but for different reasons. I think the changes at special teams coordinator didn't get mentioned here. That's a huge one to me. I think the change at defensive coordinator is much bigger than they understand. Even when they're understanding that it's a bit underrated, it's so much bigger than what they understand it to be, the upgrade there. And it's going to be much bigger than anybody outside of Cleveland understands it to be. Obviously, they did the upgrades in the roster and everything else. Look, this team should be good. They should expect to be good. You should expect them to be good. And let me make this clear. I'm not saying you should hope for the Browns to be good. Hope ain't got nothing to do with this. They should be good. If they ain't good, then there's going to be people who have to pay, right? Last year, we were hoping they were going to be good. And that's why when they weren't good, nobody got fired. We were hoping. We wanted them to be good. But for reasons that became obvious, it didn't happen last year. This year, we're not hoping for anything, right? This is different than 2020. This is different than 2021. This is different than 2019, 2018, and 2022 from the mere standpoint of we're not hoping for anything. We are expecting this team to be good. You know, now they're not going to be beat teams by 40 out the gate. They might never be. We're just going to blow out bad teams good, but they should be good, right? You know, but that's the expectation. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Y'all have a great day.